Tell us about the worst colleague you have ever worked with. There was a coworker who had a special gift. He could insert himself into any conversation and talk like he was an expert, and I mean on literally any topic. If it was something he clearly knew nothing about, he'd slowly twist the conversation toward whatever subject you wanted to discuss. Talking to him was like playing that Wikipedia game where you start on Star Wars and somehow end up at minority issues. And of course, 98% of every conversation was just him monologuing. Everyone was too polite and conflict averse to call him out, so we all tried to avoid him, but he just followed people around anyway. I eventually quit the job, but I'll never forget the nightmare I had where he was the best man at my wedding. In one office I worked at, we had a strict no perfume policy. One woman, already difficult to deal with, was so offended by this that she smuggled in her entire perfume collection. She'd walk around spraying perfume in empty offices and cubicles, usually early in the morning before anyone arrived. This went on for a month or two, and no one knew who was doing it. We started calling the mystery culprit the Chanel Bandit. Eventually, cameras caught her red-handed. She had gone on a 3-week vacation and didn't realize we'd installed cameras after a recent break-in. Funny enough, during her vacation, the Chanel Bandit suddenly stopped. When she came back and got caught, she resigned. Nobody missed her cedar-scented chaos when she left. Back in high school, I worked at McDonald's with a guy named Daniel. His whole personality was I go to the gym and play on a soccer team. He also had one very unique habit. Dude would go number 2 5 times a day. After every trip to the bathroom, he'd puff out his chest, square his shoulders, and announce that was the 3rd epic Daniel of the day, like it was some kind of achievement. Other than that, he just didn't work at all. At one job, we had this guy who unloaded a whole bunch of disgusting comments in the break room in front of like 30 people. My husband happened to be sitting there waiting for me and heard every word. I went straight to HR and listed all the witnesses. The dude was just beyond gross, absolutely in a league of his own. When I was an intern, there was this older, cranky lady in the office who loved summoning people to her desk. Mine was right next to hers, separated only by a thin wall. She'd gossip with one person, then immediately call someone else over to tell them what the first person had said. It was an endless cycle of drama. She also tried to pin her own mistakes on others. On top of that, she was extremely arrogant and flat out refused to learn basic modern skills. For example, she absolutely refused to learn how to add hyperlinks in emails or documents. Truly a ray of sunshine in human form. During one of my shifts, I worked at a bunch of factories, but one mainly hired people with criminal records. They paid peanuts, and the work was brutal, both physically and mentally. I had just finished school, and this was only my second factory job, so I didn't really know what to expect. One guy we worked with got nicknamed Big Matt because we already had another Matt. Big Matt was a hardcore fan of mystery sprinkles and steroids, a huge shredded guy, but at 35, he still lived with his mom. He said it was because he'd witnessed something terrible happen to her as a kid and didn't want to leave her alone. At the time, I thought, wow, that explains the supplements. He just wants to be strong to protect her. I was such an idiot. 2 months later, Big Matt and 2 other coworkers didn't show up. When I asked the supervisor, he didn't know either. The next day, one of them came in and explained that all 3 had been arrested. Apparently, they bought an ounce of herbal confetti and Big Matt's mom called the cops. Before they arrived, Big Matt, a 2-meter-tall gym monster, beat his mom half to death for snitching. The next day I checked, he was officially booked in the local jail. Definitely the worst coworker I've ever had. There was a guy named Dan. He was 37, worked a dead-end job, sorting lab samples in a windowless room 9 hours a day. He ate only Burger King, no salad because that's rabbit food, drank 4 liters of Mountain Wednesday a day, and wondered why people freaked out. It's mostly water, he'd say. He got nauseous eating corn and even ended up hospitalized once. He was convinced humans and dinosaurs coexisted and had a bunch of other theories based on his gut feelings. During a 2016 pre-election debate, he said, "If Bernie Sanders becomes president, civil war will break out, and I won't hesitate. I'll take out you and your family." Dan eventually got fired, and I quit soon after. Don't be like Dan. Last summer, I worked on an off-site exhibition, not Harry Potter themed. Out of 200 applicants, only 20 got hired. The team was tight-knit, bonded over the exhibition theme. Everyone was great except one woman. She thought she was the world's biggest star because of a 3-second cameo in Game of Thrones. She harassed team members with passive-aggressive messages, pursued a guy in the store team who wasn't interested, undermined leadership, and raged at visitors. She'd get vengeful if she thought we were talking about her behind her back. One day, after a guy firmly rejected her, she took her anger out on me. She'd badmouth me to others, but never to my face, calling me a white snake. I'm albino, and I'd already faced bullying for my hair color in school, so these insults really hurt. I couldn't take it anymore and reported her to HR. She was fired. I worked in a preschool, and our group, which always has 2 teachers, got a new assistant. She was basically a trainee teacher. Right from the start, she constantly argued about everything and loved to challenge both company rules and state early education regulations because, in her words, they're dumb. She was late every day during her first week. All of this slowly piled up. One day, I was changing a diaper while she sat on the floor holding a 2-year-old on her lap. I noticed one child biting another and said, "Do something." I couldn't leave the diaper-changing baby to intervene myself. She didn't get up. I repeated myself and she said, "Well, I have a child on my lap." I told her, "Put him on the floor." She replied, "He's strong." I swear, she acted like a grown adult couldn't move a toddler because he had some kind of super strength. The kid bit another child again, and I got frustrated. I told her to get up and handle it right now. She said, "What, I'm supposed to watch all 4 kids while you're busy with just one?" I finished changing the diaper, poked my head out the door, and told the supervisor, "Remove this woman from my group." She was removed, and after reviewing the security footage, a report was filed against her. The following week, she was fired for skipping work without notice. I've worked with plenty of idiots in preschools, but this lady managed to show her full brand of awful in a very short time. I used to work at a grocery store, and one of the women in charge of scheduling was a real nightmare. When you work retail, you expect weird shifts. I never complained about that. But after nearly 2 years on the job, I broke my thumb and wrist, needed surgery. To apply for unemployment benefits, I needed a simple verification form from my employer. I asked her to send it in, and she said she did, but when I checked with the unemployment office, they told me they hadn't received anything. I went back to her again and again and again. In total, I asked 4 times. She never sent it. In the end, I had to borrow money from my parents just to pay rent over Christmas while I was recovering. The worst coworker I ever had was back when I worked as a cashier at Balm. One day she came up to me and asked me to cash her paycheck. I was still new and hadn't been trained on that function yet, so she showed me how to do it herself. I ran the transaction and went back to my shift like nothing happened. A couple of days later, managers called me into the office, surrounded me, and accused me of theft. After lots of tears, checking the security footage, and me explaining what had happened, they told me she had pulled the same trick on several other employees that day. They just wanted to make sure I wasn't in on it. Honestly, forget Volm and forget that shady gremlin who nearly got me arrested. I worked with a girl who would sometimes just lie down on the floor and play on her phone. She regularly threw tantrums over her boyfriend and sometimes cursed loudly in front of customers. Eventually, she got fired for smoking some mystery sprinkles at work. When I worked at a restaurant, I was friends with a bartender, a good guy, until he got promoted to manager. That tiny bit of power and extra stress turned him into a constant jerk. One day he yelled at me, saying I was doing a terrible job because I hadn't done something I had never been asked to do before. Because of him, I missed my last bus and couldn't get home. It was dark outside and I ended up sitting on a bench in front of the restaurant, crying. It was hands down the worst workday and the worst coworker I've ever had. It took me a long time to convince myself that I wasn't a terrible worker. He just couldn't handle stress. About 2 years ago, I started working as a receptionist at an audiology clinic. We handle hearing aids and hearing tests. Before this job, the only thing I knew about hearing aids was that my grandfather had one. 8 months into my job, so I had exactly 8 months of experience in everything related to this field, we hired a new specialist. Later, I found out she knew absolutely nothing. Not about hearing aids, not about basic workplace skills anyone should have, not how to communicate with bosses, patients, or people over the phone. For example, we had a patient who left her hearing aids for repair. She would occasionally call to check on progress, and I would say, "I'll ask the specialist to call you back with an update." And I really did ask. 4 months later, the same patient called again, and that's when I discovered the specialist had ignored all my requests and never called back. Another example, she never, and I mean never, remembered to clock in and out. Every day was a struggle to get her to mark her attendance. Then she had to send corrections to the timesheet almost daily, complaining to me that management was unhappy. She didn't know how to fill out repair forms, so every time we submitted something, I had to check everything to make sure it was filled out correctly and legibly. And remember, she was a certified specialist and I was a receptionist with 8 months of hearing aid experience. She could go weeks without updating patient records. The charts would just pile up in a corner of her office. She'd forget to fill them out, put the wrong dates, and make spelling errors and names. I had to double check everything before sending the charts back to the archive. If she didn't know what to do with a patient, which happened often, she simply did nothing. I had to handle the patient myself, listen to their complaints, call manufacturers, and even recommend hearing aids when she refused to. She constantly forgot that patients needed to sign documents. I would put a sticker on the chart that said patient must sign and remind her beforehand. Yet she still let people leave without signatures on contracts, purchase agreements, or medical authorizations. She couldn't manage time at all, often delaying appointments by 10 to 30 minutes. I had to deal with frustrated patients. I'd say, "Hey, time," and she'd reply, "Okay," and then immediately ignore me. She could keep elderly patients waiting for their first appointment for 2 hours or more, even though it normally takes about 90 minutes. Sometimes the patients themselves had to speak up because they were tired or their legs hurt, and these were people over 80. And the best part? Whenever something went wrong, it was always my fault. She blamed me for her poorly done work, her inability to manage patients, and her failure to sell hearing aids. Basically, everything that went wrong, I was the scapegoat. After 6 months, I finally decided to speak up. I had stayed quiet until then because personally she could be somewhat pleasant and I felt sorry for her, but everyone has a limit. Management had also started paying attention because she wasn't bringing in any revenue. They made her attend daily Zoom meetings with supervisors and mentors. That's when it finally became clear why her sales were near zero. She was completely incompetent. It was obvious, and she was fired. They said they were going to close the clinic entirely, but in reality, they hired a new specialist, much more educated, confident, young, and proficient with an iPhone. As a result, I only got a laughably small 30-cent raise at the end of the year and had to up my anxiety medication dosage. On the bright side, I improved a lot in my own work. Now the new specialist and I are best friends, and working has become much more enjoyable. I work with a janitor in a hospital, transporting patients for tests or room changes. I work nights. She started at 6 a.m. She was one of the nastiest people I've ever met. Usually I get along with most colleagues, but she dragged everyone down with her negative energy. One of her habits? Dropping patients off at X-ray and returning to the office without them. Most X-rays take 2 to 5 minutes, max 10. Every morning I had to send her back to retrieve the patients after the radiologist called. This happened constantly, and I reported it several times to the supervisor, both in person and via email. She had conflicts with every department, never informed nurses about patient movements, which is strictly forbidden. Once she left a patient alone at admissions for 15 to 30 minutes. These incidents, along with a year's worth of evidence, led to her termination. When she was fired, it felt like a dark cloud lifted, and she even tried to gather signatures to dispute it. Only one person signed. We had a guy at the restaurant who showed up every day as if it was his very first shift. He'd forget everything we taught him the day before. For the first 30 minutes, he'd work kinda okay. After that, he'd be glued to his phone, trying to do tasks one-handed, which in a kitchen is not ideal. Didn't stop him though. Then one week, he just stopped showing up entirely. Came back a week later acting surprised that he'd been fired. To be fair, maybe he had some memory issues, I don't know. But he never mentioned anything to us or the owner. Instead, he'd go on rants about how easy our work was, since he'd already had 4 restaurant jobs before. Keep in mind, he was only 19. Still, he'd forget basic stuff like where the burger buns were kept or which buttons to press on the register. He always left trash lying around, and the rest of us had to clean up after him. His excuse was always the same: someone's gonna clean it anyway. These days, he sometimes drops by just to sit and watch TV, sometimes with friends, sometimes alone. Never buys anything, but he sits quietly, so nobody kicks him out. I once worked in a scientific lab with a visiting researcher from another country. This guy spent most of his time asking endless, totally irrelevant questions and distracting everyone else. In an entire year, he designed exactly one very basic experiment and didn't even run it. Apparently, hands-on work was beneath him. He'd pick fights with anyone whose work even remotely overlapped with his because he didn't want to share authorship. He never cleaned up after himself, refused to pick things up from the floor, and acted helpless about the tiniest tasks. Once, he literally called me from another room because he couldn't figure out how to remove a tea bag without a string. Another time, he asked me to pick up items that had fallen off a coat rack because he just wasn't going to. It was like working with a spoiled toddler. No idea how, but he was in the process of getting a PhD. Eventually, our boss fired him, and she told me he was one of only 2 people she'd let go in her 30-year career. We once hired a cook who came with glowing recommendations. For the first 2 weeks, everything seemed fine. Then I noticed food supplies starting to disappear. Not long after that, some basic kitchen items went missing too. One day, a customer told me that the cook had been sneaking in a 30% auto tip on their bill. When I checked the reports, I realized he was adding that same 30% tip to every single card transaction. Meanwhile, our cash numbers didn't match up at all. I fired him that same day. The next morning, he came back, apologized, and said he was on mystery sprinkles and heading to rehab. I wished him luck. The day after that, he tried to break in after hours and got caught. Absolute genius move. My former boss was one of those too nice to function people. Her laugh was like a nervous tick, constant and exhausting. She couldn't be assertive at all, which is obviously not ideal when your job is telling others what to do. The best she could manage was passive-aggressive politeness when she really needed something, which just annoyed everyone. On my 3rd day at a new job, my manager literally dumped a bag of garbage onto my desk. She said it was a reminder that taking out the trash was part of my duties, even though it wasn't listed anywhere in my job description. At the time, I was working as an assistant analyst at a mortgage firm. Our company had a full cleaning staff, but way back in the day, my department occasionally helped pick up trash from the parking lot. Eventually, corporate cut hours and officially told us not to do it anymore. One morning, our branch manager came in early, gathered a bunch of parking lot trash, and then dumped it all on my desk. After that, he chewed out all the managers in front of everyone because of my department. And that was just the tip of the iceberg when it came to the nonsense he pulled. This was about 15 years ago, and people still talk about it. On my first job, I was a veterinary assistant in a small animal clinic. One middle-aged admin woman constantly criticized me in my work. When I mentioned to a coworker that I planned to study veterinary medicine, she laughed and said, "I don't see you as a vet at all." I was only 16 at the time, full of dreams and already taking steps toward them. I just stood there shocked, holding back tears. At 18, I go into vet school, and I'm still pursuing my dream. I guess I'll prove her wrong someday. The worst coworker I ever had was straight up a mystery sprinkles addict. I worked with him for 4 months before I found out he was secretly living in the office. He acted bizarre even during the day. After he was fired, we discovered a hidden mattress in the storage room along with a still packaged party pipe tucked away. And he wasn't living there alone. His relatives were with him. They left food everywhere, like pizza crusts in the toilet brush holder. Seriously, what? And the sink was full of hair because apparently they were showering there. We didn't even have showers in the building. Once, he texted saying his alarm hadn't gone off and he'd be late. He kept pushing the time back and finally strolled in at 4:40 p.m. We closed at 5. Reminder, he was living in the office the whole time. To make things even wilder, his girlfriend basically lived there too. She'd lurk around the office, moving in ways so nobody could see her face. We even joked that maybe she had a warrant out or something, because almost no one had ever gotten a clear look at her. When she wasn't hiding with him in the storage room, she spent the whole day sitting in their Nissan Altima outside with the engine running for AC. On top of that, he actually tried to get her hired at our company. That idea got shut down immediately. She'd wander barefoot across the concrete warehouse floor, which was rarely cleaned, like it was totally normal. As for his actual work, completely useless. Once he suggested to my coworker, who was scanning documents into PDFs, that she should just take photos of every page on her phone instead. He'd flood my inbox with emails that made 0 sense. Eventually, I just started forwarding them straight to my boss so he could see for himself. The whole situation was equal parts sad and ridiculous. He even brought his girlfriend to an interview once and asked if she could sit in the office because it was too hot outside, which might have been fine, except there was literally a Walmart and a giant mall next door. It just screamed unprofessional. And the craziest part, they still hired him. In the end, all he managed to do was completely tank one free project we were working on. And yes, all of this happened at an engineering firm. Thanks so much for watching. Like this video and check out our other episodes. See you next time.